So Divinity made a video in which he discusses how European colonialists used Christianity as a tool to introduce Western notions into Aboriginal cultures in the US. And she expresses her chagrin at how so many Indigenous people have enthusiastically adopted Christianity. And her video inspired me to make this video because it seems as though the situation in Canada is rather different. And what I mean by different is that although I know a fair number of First Nations people, and that's the terminology we use in Canada because they were literally the first nations of people to live here, I don't think I've ever met a single First Nations person who is a practicing Christian. And I've never even heard of a First Nations person in Canada defending Christianity. And Indigenous people in the US were probably not treated all that differently, but apparently the efforts to convert them to Christianity were a lot more effective than they were in Canada. Historically, the Canadian approach to Christianizing the Indigenous population was through abduction and forced indoctrination in what we call residential schools. Now, one of the biggest reasons why I wanted to make this video is that while my Canadian viewers will know immediately what I'm talking about, I have never heard anybody say anything about the Canadian residential school system outside of Canadian media. So I don't know how familiar people outside of Canada are with it. And Canada has this reputation for being very friendly and open and tolerant and multicultural. And Canadians and non-Canadians seem to have this idea that Muslims have it so much better here in Canada than in the US, and black Canadians are so much better off than black Americans. But there seems to be this disturbing denial among Canadians and lack of awareness among non-Canadians of the absolutely horrific treatment of Indigenous populations in Canada. What's particularly disturbing about this is that I will hear Canadians who would be aghast at expressions of racism against people of African ancestry say the most explicitly racist things against First Nations people. The way Canada imposed Christianity on its Indigenous population was by forcibly taking Aboriginal children from their families, putting them up in boarding schools most commonly run by the church, and indoctrinating them into Christianity and European Canadian culture. These kids would be punished for speaking their own languages or practicing their own religions. The expressed goal of these programs was to assimilate First Nations people into European Canadian culture, which was a very cruel joke to begin with, because it's not as though once these kids were properly Christianized that they were automatically going to be accepted by white people in Canada. Christian or not, they were going to be treated with the same racism and contempt. And instead of effectively assimilating these kids into Western civilization, all they really did was sever them from their own cultures. They were taken from their own communities, they were forced to forget their own languages and forget their own heritage. Once these kids left the schools and returned to their own communities, they returned to a culture that was now completely alien to them. Now, I don't mean to just pick on Canada, because there were similar programs in the United States, but there seems to be something about the way it was done in Canada that stigmatized Christians and Christianity among First Nations people. There are, of course, some Aboriginal Christians, but I haven't seen the kind of acceptance of Christianity among Canadian Indigenous people as Divinity says she's seen among American Indigenous people. And maybe that has something to do with the conditions under which the residents of these schools were forced to live. Physical and sexual abuse was not just common, it was pretty much ubiquitous. Medical care was either non-existent or so inadequate that the mortality rates among the residents of these schools at worst was sometimes as high as 69%. And it was quite common that if you had kids in these schools and your kids died, nobody bothered to tell you about it. In some cases, these kids were just buried in the backyard. The problems in these schools were so bad that nowadays former residents of them are quite commonly referred to as residential school survivors. And what's so egregious to me about racism in Canada against First Nations people is despite the numerous government and church apologies for these schools and the extensive scholarship about the social effects they've had, there are so many Canadians who will still sneer at the drug abuse and alcoholism in First Nations communities as if they had nothing to do with it. White Canadians will turn their noses up at the spousal abuse and the violence on the reserves, but ignore the PTSD, and ignore the fact that the victims of these residential schools were robbed of any sense of identity they ever could have had, and sometimes even made to feel ashamed for trying to reconnect with it. First Nations people in Canada live in this Kafkaesque sort of cultural limbo in which no matter what they do, they are treated with contempt. Their problems are blamed on their stubborn insistence that they retain some of their Aboriginal identity. But even if they do try to become more Western, to get along in mainstream Canadian society, they're treated as if that's just not their proper place. White Canadians will often tell First Nations people, you know what your problem is? You're too native, you need to act more white. But the moment one of them tries to become a doctor or a lawyer or climb the corporate ladder, they're greeted with the attitude of, oh, isn't that cute? A native trying to act white.